Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Thank you for downloading and listening to This Pathological Life. If you're interested in continuing the story, we have a second series called This Medical Life. Please download it and subscribe now.
Dr. Travis Brown, why do we need a podcast called This Pathological Life?
Every disease has its own story to tell. So we're going to tell them.
I never thought I'd die alone. I laughed the loudest. Who'd have known? I traced the cord back to the wall. No wonder it was never plugged in at all. I took my time. I hurried up. The choice was mine. I didn't think enough. I'm too depressed to go on. You'll be sorry when I'm gone. I never thought I'd die alone. Another 6 months I'll be unknown. Give all my things to all my friends. You'll never step foot in my room again. You'll close it off, board it up. Remember the time that I spilled the cup of apple juice in the hall. Please tell Mum, this is not her fault.
So this is lyrics from a song written from Mark Hoppus and Tom Delonge. It's called Adam's Song. Now this is an uncharacteristic song by Blink-182, which are normally for,
It's
light-hearted
upbeat,
stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this song was in 1999, and it stood out to me when I heard it because, again, it's such an unusual story. The song was inspired when Mark, one of the band members, read a suicide note in a magazine that a teenager had left for his family. Mark wanted to write this song also because at the height of the band's success, he felt disconnected. He was somewhat depressed and isolated. So the band would go on tour with his friends. They would come home. The other band members had their long-term girlfriends at the airport, and he didn't have anyone. There's the lyrics that sort of mix this, where he's going, the tour was over, we survived. I couldn't wait till I got home to pass the time in my room alone. This episode is about health data. It can be personal and it can be intimate at times. It is about you, it is about me, and it's about everyone as an individual. And short of someone keeping a journal where they write their feelings and thoughts, it may be the most honest record of someone's experiences, their health, even sometimes the consequences of decisions that they've made. Health data is about privacy. Now, there is an argument that you shouldn't be worried about privacy if you have nothing to hide, but this misses the entire point. It assumes that those in power have your best interests at heart, which may or may not be true. And there's some quotes from some prominent people that I think bring this home. There's William J. Brennan, who stated,
If the right to privacy means anything, it is the right of the individual, married or single, to be free from unwarranted governmental intrusion.
And in 2020, I'd probably change that a little bit to say the right to privacy is to be free from unwarranted corporation or government intrusion. And we have a second quote from Edward Snowden.
Arguing that you don't care about privacy because you have nothing to hide is no different than saying you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say.
So this point becomes very focused when we consider our own health. Now, there's general things that most people don't worry about sharing, things like cholesterol, or I've got a chest infection or hypertension. But then there's things that start to get specific that may be stigmatized or very personal when we start talking about things like drug use, mental illness, depression, psychiatric disorders, even things like sexually transmitted infections. Is everyone happy to share this information with their employer or a government or a corporation or someone that has the appropriate clearance to get access to this information? We reserve that for health professionals, but then how far do we go beyond it? And this is where the song lyrics sort of brings it home. Let's assume this was a patient and then there was a risk assessment. This wasn't lyrics in a song. This is someone communicating that, and then the health record flagged this patient as a suicide risk, and help was sent. Imagine you were able to get intervention to this young man, this adolescent, to prevent a suicide. You could prevent the loss of a son, a brother, a friend, a teammate. And this is where health data becomes complex, and it affects every single one of us.
And we have some guests joining us in just a moment to take this to a much deeper level and look at how it sits in the context of governance of that data. This pathological life continues now as we move deeper into this topic of data governance in relation to health data. And joining us, we have a special guest, Andrew Andrews. He's a man who started computer programming on IBM mainframes whilst in high school in the mid-70s. He started a professional career programming statistical systems at the ABS back in 1984, around the time I was born. He's been, well, a little bit after, he's been consulting in data strategy and project management since the early 90s. He's worked across workers' comp, education, insurance, health sectors. He's mentored startups at Adelaide and Flinders universities and their innovation incubators. And more recently, initiated the National Data Governance Program at the ACCC. He's now a Data Governance Manager in the Global Group Risk Division of the ANZ. He's an SA State President of the Data Management Association of Australia. He sits on the National Board. He's a collaborator with the International Data Leaders Organisation. He is the best man to join us for this conversation. Andrew Andrews, welcome.
Hi, Steve. Hi, Trav.
How are we doing, Andrew?
I want to get into data governance as it relates to health records. But before we get into that at the theoretical and level, in South Australia, at the time of recording, we've just had in the public domain a discussion about the use of health records for or against the public good. Can you just unravel this for us?
So a couple of weeks ago, there was an outbreak, a COVID outbreak, and somehow the one of the workers at one of the hotels was working at a pizza bar. Well, he actually said he was actually a customer and allegedly picked up the COVID off the box. But as it was discovered through contact tracing, the conversations in contact tracing, it was revealed, disclosed even, that he was a worker. And then the day after, when all this story broke out, the Premier and the Chief Public Health Officer said, this is what's happened. And, it was a big political story. The whole state went into lockdown. It was a whole bunch of stuff. Anyway, as of yesterday, it was disclosed, or actually announced by the police commissioner, that the conversation, that initial conversation that was had between the worker and the government contact tracing person would be sealed and would be privileged. And it was deemed to be a private health record, that conversation. And so it was privileged and therefore not disclosed to the SA police as to what was discussed. And I reflected on that, and I thought, wow, aren't we lucky we live in a country like Australia where we take health data so make it so important that we're prepared to stand up to the public, to politicians, to anyone, to the police, to say, no, you're not allowed to see it. I mean, how good is that for a country to have that level of structure around its data, public health data, private health data?
It is good, but they've already been vilified in the media as the bad guy. And 100%. so that conversation could reveal them that, well, maybe it was misinterpreted by the contact tracer. Maybe that could vindicate them.
The thing is, the thing that we're protected by is they haven't disclosed the name of the individual. Right. Okay. It hasn't gone into the public domain. I haven't seen it anywhere under the on the social media sort of conversations. So at least they've protected that confidentiality as well.
And in our conversation earlier about this, Andrew, you mentioned the fact that what this boils down to is what was the context and the purpose of that information being given in the first place.
because the owner of the information is the individual, and only they have the power to delegate the authority of its use, essentially. And any state or federal government protections around data, it's always about the data being owned by the individual and its disclosure being for a purpose.
Well, that's a perfect setup to actually go deep into this topic, because I wanted to ask you if you could describe the significance of data governance when it comes to health records.
So let's go back to first principles. Data governance, there's a couple of definitions. One of them is the policies and structures and regulations you need to have to protect privacy, security, integrity, the trust in the data. That's the first purpose of data governance. The second purpose of data governance is to make sure that the right data is given to the right people at the right time for the right purposes to do something of significance or for a purpose. So there's two definitions that we use, and you play those definitions in different settings depending on what situation you're dealing with. So in the situation with public health data or private health data through the public system, it's the first one. It's making sure that confidential information remains private, and only its terms and its use is actually defined by very strict protocols, and there's penalties if you breach data trust between the individual and the clinical organism that you're dealing with, whatever that is, whether it's a pathology lab or a public hospital or a private hospital, a GP, allied health, whatever. It's defined.
Is it your sense within our health systems that there is a robust literacy when it comes to understanding governance in this context?
In the health setting? Every doctor that comes through university has they swear to the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. Mm-hmm. Well, that extends the data as much as it does to the personal individual, right? So by disclosing data in an inappropriate setting, you're actually doing harm. So from an ethical and clinical perspective, they understand how confidential data needs to stay confidential. So every doctor that I know, every clinician I know, anyone in the industry knows how important, how special it is to protect private data.
So I was just going to ask, Australia, where it sits, clearly that example gives a good indication that we're probably prioritising the individual more than sort of the state. Yeah. How are we sitting with other Western countries or even just in general in the world for data protection?
I think Australia is advanced, but maybe in some areas not as advanced, or is getting more advanced in some areas, but I think Europe is more advanced in some areas. In Europe, they have the general data protection regulations across the EU, and the data governance of consumer data in the EU has been regulated for several years now, and we're just evolving those frameworks here in Australia. In Australia, there's a legislation called the Consumer Data Right, which actually protects consumer data, and it's being rolled out now in the banking sector right now as we speak. But we're a few years behind the EU on that. I think I think health data across the world is highly protected, and it's probably the most protected. Health and education data across the world in the Western world is highly protected because we value the individual, we value the integrity of that data. I think in developing nations, I think it's probably something not as culturally as acceptable or as required to be that strict with data protection. Although in the developing nations like India, China. Well, China's an interesting context because of its the political situation there. Because, for example, in a Chinese schoolroom, they have AI watching the students. They have AI watching the teachers. They're looking at behaviour. They're actually continuously monitoring the behaviour of the students in the classroom. So you can imagine they're collecting data for a different purpose, and maybe not with the disclosure of the parents either, by the way, as the carers. So I think there's actually, it relates back to cultural norms in a lot of ways as to how we value and protect the rights of the individual, the citizen.
If I go take back to that comment you made in the GP setting, for example, that GPs swear the Hippocratic Oath. And obviously, I would expect everyone who listens to this podcast would understand they would never willfully do harm by willfully making information available that's not. But it's where it happens in a way that's unexpected, because we might not realise the consequences of the way we're storing health records, or the transferring and the protection of information has vulnerability. So I wonder, for anyone who's managing health practices or in a hospital setting, are there some rules of thumbs? Are there some questions they should be asking of their organisation that would help make awareness of where there might be vulnerabilities in their protocols and their tech?
Sure. First question is, when in doubt, don't.
Okay.
Right. That's the very first question everyone asks. If there's any questions about whether this disclosure is appropriate or required, don't disclose. Hold on to it until you definitely know that you can. GP practices are becoming more digital by the day. I mean, just yesterday I noticed that GPs can now issue scripts digitally, and people can collect them using a QR code at, patients can collect them now at a QR code in a pharmacy as of yesterday here in South Australia. So I think they're becoming, GPs and clinicians are becoming more data literate or understanding, and probably I know if I speak to my GP, who's old school, he will not use my health record data. He just will not do it. But there are obviously younger GPs who are more comfortable and realise that the benefits of the greater good outweigh the individual risks. It's going to evolve. It's new technology. I mean, health data in the public domain run through the My Health Record system. It's new. It's prone to issues. So far, I haven't heard of any, inadvertent disclosures, through hacking or anything like that. At the beginning, I was actually not in favour. I've learnt to trust it, and I think I'm going to change my own personal disclosure to say, you can have it. You can have the data. That's from a personal level, because I think it's the technology's had time to mature, and I think I can learn to trust it a bit more now.
And there's the balance and the nuance, isn't it? We're looking at protecting our privacy instead of giving to the state. But for many of us, and I was the same, I yielded to the
My Health Record.
I yielded to My Health Record because I thought it was for the common good as well. That was the driving force for me. As much as there might be benefit for me, there's benefit for the community.
Yeah. I mean, for me is really selfish, because if me as a late 50s diabetic, I don't want to be in a hospital and they're saying, I don't have any of the medical records on Andrew, right? And I wanted to make sure that I'm saved, I have the best chance of being saved. I mean, but that's the purpose for the data, right? Is to save people when they're in critical situations.
Yes.
So then the challenge, though, is that there is inherent trust in government, mainly because of how's it going to be used? How do I know it's going to be used? I mean, we have the classic case of My Health Record, which initially the police were going to have access to straight away without even going through the courts, which was even a relaxation of the privacy that we currently have. Is there any way to get reassurance that it's going to be okay to hand over that information that we're going, or is there rigid rules that are going to be relaxed, or is it going to go the other way, do you think?
I think the government, if you recall that incident, they changed the regulation, the laws actually, and they responded saying there's a loophole in the and it's actually not in the public interest to have that open, and they knew that people were going to run away from using the system if they didn't close it, and they did. So I think the whole issue in Australia has actually now gone quiet because there's no issues.
Okay.
Right. So I've learned. I think we should trust it because, hey, you know how much data people have on us already as citizens outside of the clinical system.
Yeah.
Everything. Everything. Everyone who's got a phone has got access to your data. So
as we draw this conversation to a close, I just want to dive into your history, Andrew, because in some ways you've been a voice in the wilderness in some settings in the past in championing taking data governance seriously.
Sure.
Is there anything you can share from your story of an anecdote of a time where that persistence has paid off and And what do you think was the resistance you had to work against? Because there are going to be other people listening to this in corporate situations where that might still be at play.
Okay, so if we manage data like we do money, imagine how different our world would be.
Oh.
Right? So our challenge in the data governance community globally, there's two challenges. One of them is how much value do you ascribe to the data? First thing, because it costs something to create, to maintain, and to report and deliver, and actually has a purpose which has a value attached to it. Second thing is data literacy. The whole purpose of what data is and how to use it and why it's important. They're our two challenges, and it's been, most of my career has actually been swimming upstream in changing culture. And it's only things like we're doing now with the podcasting that we're actually able to educate the community in general on what data really means. Because if we manage data like we did money, our world would be different. We would be doing things differently with the way we collect and store and disseminate data.
Because we know that the money has a value.
We know that money has value and there's fiscal controls in place around the world, but we don't have those level of controls in data.
Well, there was actually said in a documentary that data has now overtaken oil as the most valuable commodity.
And how long has it taken for that to happen? It's a long time, but it's getting better, and that's really good.
And the interesting thing is we've only started drilling for it just recently.
Correct.
Andrew Andrews, thanks for taking some time out of your busy life to join this conversation.
I'm thrilled for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Andrew.
For the final part of this episode into health data and data governance, we have another special guest. We have the co-founder and CEO of Precigen, Dr. Michelle Perugini, and welcome to This Pathological Life, Michelle.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
For people listening in, I'll just mention that you have a PhD in medicine. You founded 2 global AI tech companies. Your first, which was acquired by EY in 2015. You're the co-founder and CEO, as I mentioned, of Precigen, an AI healthcare company with an advanced AI platform, and first product, Life Whisperer, that uses AI for embryo selection in IVF and is being sold globally. You're a dedicated mentor and advisor to many startups, a member of the Australian Commonwealth Government Research and Development Incentives Committee. So you are perfect to bring us home in this conversation. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks so much. Looking forward to it.
The first place I want to touch base on is about the good use of health data, because we've looked at some stories, we've heard of the risks and the importance of data governance. But I just wonder, what is the value awaiting us, Michelle, when we apply properly data analysis and behavioural patterning?
The amount of value that data analysis and data can provide to all these new age technologies is enormous. And if you consider the industry that we're in artificial intelligence, which is completely underpinned by data. And if there's good governance around that data, then that data can build very powerful products that can drastically improve clinical efficiency, improve patient outcomes through better clinical decisioning. And in the case of Life Whisperer, we can actually create babies using data and creating AI that can assist with what is currently a very difficult process for the clinician.
This is fascinating for someone like me who is a layperson in this field. It does seem like I'm hearing the plot from a science fiction movie in the future, and you're already there. Could you share a couple of stories about how you're using data in these fields in which you're operating? Take us through an anecdote or two.
So in the embryo assessment process, so if you're an infertile patient and you go into an IVF treatment clinic to try and conceive a baby, what happens is you have eggs that are fertilised with sperm and then actually grown in a culture dish, so outside of the body, and then you develop embryos that one of which needs to be selected by the clinician to put back into your uterus to hopefully create a baby. Now, that process of embryo selection is really critical to the success of a pregnancy outcome, but it's actually an incredibly difficult thing for a clinician to assess the embryos and determine which one is more or less likely to lead to a pregnancy. And so what our system has done is we've trained an AI, which is a computer algorithm, to look at thousands or tens of thousands of historical images of embryos where we know whether a pregnancy resulted or not. And it has learned, and it just builds up a very simple, it's not simple, but for the computer it's simple, it builds up a classification system of those embryos. And then next time we drag and drop an image of a new embryo, it knows whether it looks more like one that resulted in a pregnancy or didn't.
I would imagine that there's quite a wow factor with people involved, because when you're going through IVF, your emotions are already charged. What has been the sort of reactions and experiences and the reticence or the willingness to embrace this on the part of the health professionals, but also the couples, the parents-to-be?
Yeah, I mean, the value proposition for the patients is enormous for this type of technology, because what we're doing is reducing the number of IVF treatment cycles they need to go through, and it's an incredibly traumatic and stressful and very financially constraining process for the patient. So we've had an amazing response from patients. But interestingly, from the clinics themselves, they've actually been quite open to adoption of this type of technology as well, because what it does is it creates efficiency within their laboratories, within their IVF clinics, such that they can service more patients, and there's a huge demand for IVF. But it also improves their success rates, and that's what patients shop around for. So it's really, the value proposition is quite strong for both the clinic and the patient, and the feedback has been amazing, and it's just such a simple, scalable system to use. They drag and drop embryo images onto a web-based application. It takes about 10 seconds to run the AI analysis. Everything's automated, and it's bringing the global intelligence from, the global IVF community and global data to that IVF clinic and helping them make the very best decision for their patients. So it's quite amazing, and they really love it.
If only we could have such great data when it comes to dating in the first place.
I'm not going to touch that one.
For people listening in who might be running a GP clinic or some other medical or allied health entity, we've already looked at the seriousness of managing data and where things can go wrong. But if we just look positively at what could be embraced, what benefits are there awaiting them if they do take some steps down the path of exploring greater use of data and data analysis in their practice?
It's a really interesting and difficult question, because what you want to manage is kind of the misuse of data, and make sure that the governance is right and that you understand where that data is going and what it's being used for. I think that's really important for everyone to understand. But one of the important things if you're running your own clinic is to understand that data is the future, and it is going to underpin every technology that is going to have a positive impact on their industry down the track. And so if they're not in the business of collecting data, they should probably start getting some cadence around the data that they collect and how they kind of store it, even if they're not utilising it straight away, because you're going to need data cadence and governance and the ability to collect and utilise data with all of these new future technologies that are going to come about. So, and it's kind of like, I liken it to internet banking. Back in the day when internet banking first came out, no one wanted to put their private information on internet banking and access their accounts. I think over time, practicality and clinical outcome will outweigh the risks of the data. And so long as there's good data governance structures in place to manage those risks, I think it will be, our future is going to be data.
And just in closing, what does good data governance look like in such a practice? Are there some telltale signs that we're getting it right?
That's a really difficult question to answer. In the industry that that I operate in and in the healthcare sector more generally, data governance is critically important because abuse or misuse of the private patient information can have serious ramifications for the patient, but it's also heavily regulated industry with lots of data laws that govern different countries in the world. And so I think compliance with the local government data governance laws is important. I think ethics and consent is another layer around good data governance, so making sure that the patient is aware of data that you're collecting and the purpose for which you're collecting it for. And then obviously maintaining or managing third-party access to that data is really important. So we as a company undertake never to move or on-sell or utilise patient data for any purpose other than for which it was collected. We have really strict protocols around that. We comply with all of the global regulations around data collection and governance. So there are many guides around, but I think to be honest, it's kind of an evolving space, and it's different depending on the country that you operate in.
And I do promise this is the last question. Just for anyone who does want to take this further, are there any leading countries or institutions around the world to keep an eye on, to learn from, who seem to be at the forefront of developing what might be world's best practice in this field?
Not really. I can't pinpoint any specific ones, but there are, I mean, if you look up kind of data privacy and data governance guidelines, you'll see things around, for example, the US has their HIPAA guidance, and that Europe has GDPR, which is extremely stringent and protective from the patient perspective. So they're always good to keep track of what's happening with those types of guidances. Australia is probably not quite as advanced in that area, but we do have really good ethical guidance around, the Australian government's putting together this ethics committee around how data is collected and how AI is utilised and other technologies like AI that are heavy data utilisers. So I think it's just really generally keeping on top of what's happening in the world and what other countries are aspiring to in terms of data protection and governance.
Dr. Michelle Perugini, thank you for joining us and fueling our curiosity and our awareness for this particular episode and this topic.
It's been a pleasure.
This Pathological Life is produced by ClinPath Pathology in South Australia. Episode notes, references and learning objectives, when applicable, can be found at thispathological.life.com.au. And you can contact the hosts on Twitter via @Dr. Travis Brown or @Steve Davis. Thanks again for listening, and just a reminder, if you haven't done it yet, have a quick search in your podcast app for our second series, This Medical Life. Dr. Travis Brown has rolled up some extra guests, some extra topics, and we continue the story there, and we'd love to have you along.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.